in a race, it's not about throwing like 100 little jabs and surges. You have to find a moment in time for the knockout punch. So this is true on track racing especially. In fact, it's probably more applicable in track racing now that I say it. I always think like in an 800 meter race or a 1500 meter race, you have one move, decide when you're going to make it and be decisive. Be all in on that move and make that decision at the point when you're going to get maximal return from making that move.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with the man across from me, Alex Osberg, the man who has taken the podcast feed by storm. Every month, he is back, he is better, and this month we are breaking down 4 most recent editions of The Rundown by The Running Effect, written by Alex Osberg himself, which in my opinion is the best newsletter out there if you are a runner who is chasing after success and excellence, not just within running, but within life. As always, I've left a first link in the show notes. Alex, how you doing, man?
Good. I was just saying, we had a little backlog to get through of newsletters from when I was in Japan for the World Championships, but now that I'm back from my vacation and we're fully caught up, we should be up to speed, and I'm looking forward to breaking these 4 down. Among one of these 4 is the highest performing newsletter that we've put out yet, so I'm looking forward to going through that one.
It's going to be a good one, and not a bad reason to have a backlog. Just casual being a coach for Nike at the World Championships in Tokyo. Can't complain with that. Diving right in, Alex. First edition. This is actually a concept that I brought up to you a couple months ago, funny enough, because it was a concept or parts of this concept I was thinking about and wrestling with around the topic of sacrifice. The title of this one is Sacrifice Isn't Sustainable, Why the Best Don't See Deprivation, Only Direction. Alex, why is sacrifice not sustainable?
Yeah, I think we can start off by going into a little bit of a semantics discussion here about how people perceive the word sacrifice and what it means in their life. The reality is that something only feels like a sacrifice when you're comparing 2 things of equal value to you. So it's like, oh, I really want to do this thing, but I'm pulled in a separate direction. And the reality is that when you actually commit to something fully, everything else in the periphery kind of fades into irrelevance. And once you go all in, that sense of loss that you would get from committing to one path rather than another tends to fade, and clarity replaces what otherwise used to be conflict. So I think that the best people don't see themselves as sacrificing, quote unquote, and running away from like pleasure. They see themselves running towards purpose, and they're not depriving themselves of experiences they otherwise couldn't have. They are actually like enjoying the day-to-day process. They're enjoying the things that they're doing so much that if they have to forego some traditional freedoms or luxuries of daily life, to them it doesn't even really register because they're so committed to their task and like they see no other way forward.
I think as you were speaking there, sacrifice is this really weighty word. I'll put some words to it from like a high school perspective. I remember in high school, all your friends are hanging out late who aren't athletes and don't really quite understand why you can't, go to their house or hang out or whatever it might be, because everyone knows the feeling of having a workout or long run the next morning and knowing deep down you have to go to bed at 10 if you want your 8 hours of sleep. And I think the best of the best don't necessarily, as we're talking about, view that as a sacrifice. It's just kind of an inherent decision that they know they need to make to be great. What would you say to someone who is in that position where they hear that kind of example and they're like, it does feel really weighty and it feels like a sacrifice? How can you switch camps?
I think you need to determine what your priorities are. I think we've talked about this before. In life, I think you can have almost anything you want, but not everything you want, especially not at the same point in time. And sometimes you need to undergo short-term sacrifices to get what you want in the long term. And so I think typically if you're feeling this sense of internal conflict, it's because you're probably not clear enough on what your priorities are. And I think you need to realize that by going all in on one thing, you're going to derive a lot more satisfaction, fulfillment, and value out of that than if you're trying to spread yourself thin between multiple pursuits. So I would say there's a time and a place to explore, and especially that's true early in life, but you only have so much bandwidth to take on certain projects. And I think in a podcast we did several years ago, someone told me in college that, you can only really do like 2 of 3 things well. And it was something like you can have a social life, you can have good grades, and sleep. And like, it's hard to do all 3 of those things really well. There's going to have to be a trade-off somewhere. And I think that people in life don't always appreciate that really life is about choosing your trade-offs. It's about choosing what you're going to be mediocre at so that you can be absolutely excellent in one thing.
It kind of goes to your point that you've shared on podcast way long ago about how you do one thing is how you do everything, or all things is actually a myth. And I feel like it kind of relates to that point of you can't be good at everything all at once. It's unrealistic. Can you elaborate? I know it's a little out of the scope, but even for my mind and a refresher, if you remember that kind of myth, why you do one thing is how you do all things.
Yeah. No, there's this phrase that gets tossed around, I think, very casually in high performance circles, which is like, the way you do one thing is the way you do all things. And I sometimes laugh because when I think about like in college, I think highly competitive athletes definitely approach life with a certain level of intensity, deliberateness, and intentionality. That is definitely a common thread between everything that they do. But I think they recognize that there's a minimum time investment involved to be really elite at something. And you have to pick where you're going to be dedicating most of that time and energy, and which other ones you're going to just put on maintenance mode for a period of time. Like, you have all these pots on the stove, and like you can't have them all boiling over at the same point in time. You kind of have to pick and choose where you're going to put your energy. So while I think that your approach can be similar between different things, I think there are people in life that you look at and you're like, this is a serious person, right? They take their commitment seriously. They show up on time. They're respectful. Those kind of traits are, like, I think, commonalities across the board in everything that you do. But to assume that you can be producing outputs at high qualities amongst like 5 different things at the same point in time just isn't going to happen. So I think that, and you know, you'll see this all the time, like the best athletes are sometimes really, really good students, but at Stanford, well, I think back in the day, I brought up the example, like Roger Bannister broke 4 minutes in the mile when he was a med student. And we've gotten to a point right now where the degree of specialization and the degree of preparation that's required to become a doctor right now makes it almost impossible. I'm not saying it is impossible, but it's very, very difficult to be a professional athlete and a med student or a resident at the same point in time. Those are like few and far between at the most. So that's just one example of where it comes up.
I really like this piece within the Transcending Sacrifice section where you write, here's the paradox. The more committed you are, the less peripheral things feel like a sacrifice. It's painful only when you're torn between options of similar importance. Once you go all in, the sense of loss fades. Clarity replaces what used to be conflict. I feel like that's an answer to a lot of questions I would ask you. So can you elaborate on that for the listener of eliminating the paradox so you don't feel it as much and you don't feel the heartstrings tearing as much?
Yeah, exactly. I think, and I've said this before, right, that life is an exercise of prioritization. And we have a human tendency to always add things to our plate. And if something is added, almost by definition, something needs to be removed in place of it. And I think that what everyone ought to do is pick a few things that matter to them most personally. They should align those things with their health, their well-being, their performance, and their goals. And then you really need to ruthlessly cut the rest. Coach Milt always used to joke in college. He's just like, he said like, I haven't picked up golf as a hobby because like, whereas a lot of my peers have, because he's just like, what matters to me most is showing up as a father, showing up for myself, like for my health, and showing up for you guys as the best coach that I can be. I don't have time to go play 18 holes of golf on the weekend. Now, golf may fit into your prioritization framework if that's important to you and it's a social outlet or whatnot. But the point is, like, he knows that like he just doesn't have the bandwidth to go, you know, spend 5 hours a week working on his short game and hitting balls on the driving range. So, you know, I think you have to recognize that to be really elite at what you do, to escape mediocrity, which is another newsletter we're going to talk about, you can't do what everyone else does. If you do what everyone else does and you try to like have all the hobbies that your friends do who aren't performing as really high athletes, like you're not going to be able to get the results that you get by otherwise really, really focusing. Like elite athletes or really high performers recognize that they can't take their foot off the gas. Like they make goals and those goals demand certain things from them. And just to quote Jerry Schumacher, he said this the other day, it takes what it takes. And it's an uncompromising standard of excellence that you have to keep in mind.
Do you think that when you look at the sport of running and the best athletes you know, we'll say high school or college, I think pro is another level where your entire life is maybe hyper optimized for, you know, success and excellence, but high school, college to be a top athlete, Do you think you even have to make that many sacrifices to be great? I honestly would argue potentially no. Maybe that's just because of how I'm wired in my mindset, but correct me if I'm wrong. It's like, do the training, which requires maybe max of 2 hours a day. Maybe. A lot of days I feel like it doesn't, specifically if you're in high school. And then I would say eat enough and sleep 8 hours.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's more, and you can add on that list all the time, foam roll for 15 minutes and have this supplement. And like, there are all these optimizers, sure, but I feel like the basics, running isn't that hard, especially compared to a lot of other sports in terms of like, quote unquote, the things you need to sacrifice. Do you agree, disagree? I can make an argument either which way, but
I agree with you. I agree with you to a point. I think to be good, what you just described is the price of admission. Like, that's just table stakes right there. If you want to be good, in fact, probably even slightly above average, if you do those things well, I would argue that that's the list price for success. And that's what I write about in this piece. Sahil Bloom distinguishes between the list price and the real price. The real price, he says, are the things that are often hidden from sight. It's the relationships that have to be put on the back burner, right? Because you want to pursue something else. It's the opportunities you turn down by saying yes to your goal. Because I think that, again, just to become above average, you're right. What you described can be accomplished in probably, 4 hours a day. It's not necessarily an all-consuming pursuit. And sometimes if it does become all-consuming, it can be actually a little bit counterproductive. I've been there. You've probably been there. But if you're trying to be a real tip-of-the-arrow type of person and you're trying to be a world-class performer, so yes, this is a biased assessment. I'm looking at a very, very small selection of people. But just to give people some insight into that, that is when you actually need to make this thing, like, that's when sacrifice, I think, starts to matter. Because the margins of victory become smaller and smaller the higher you get up the ladder. And I just think it's that much harder to win. And when you show up and you perform on the starting line, I think you want to be able to tell yourself, I did everything in my power that I could to be ready for this moment. And I think only you will be able to have the honest conversation with yourself to know, I did this or I didn't do this. And like, at the end of the day, the results will show.
The elephant in the room that I think I didn't address there that I'm curious to get your opinion on. Do you think there's value in sitting down, and you can't necessarily quantify how talented you are, but if you're talented, you can get away with so much more than not sacrificing? Whereas me in high school, I don't care what anyone says. Yes, I've run marathons off of minimal training and run decent times, but like, I was not talented in high school compared to my peers. I feel like I had to do a lot more to be even decent. And so I feel like the list of my sacrifices had to be longer to make up for kind of the talent gap between me and other kids. Do you think that's an important discussion people should have with themselves in terms of, like, if you're even, let's be real, if you're even having to sit down and figure that out, you probably don't want to be great. But for the sake of the question, do you think that's something important to be aware of? Because the more talented you are, at least at the high school and college level, the more you probably can get away with.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is the elephant in the room. And I'll admit it's true. Like, there are some people in college and high school who, I mean, you know them, I know them, like, they're able to go out and party like almost every weekend and almost live like this dual life and somehow can still perform. I still think that it will catch up to people eventually. I think whether it's in terms of career longevity or injuries that start to sneak up on you, like, I still think that at the end of the day, that will manifest into something suboptimal. But the more talented you are, undoubtedly, it will definitely have an impact there. But I don't know. I'm of the opinion, if you're looking at just like a way to philosophically approach life, like, would you really want to win knowing that you didn't do all that you could to achieve that result? And maybe that's a very difficult question to answer. But I don't know. I don't think I'd be satisfied with myself if I knew I cut corners and still won anyway. I think the satisfaction comes from knowing that, like, you put a lot of effort into something. You invested a tremendous amount of things. Maybe you sacrifice a few things, and I'm using sacrifice in quotations there. But I think ultimately that's what makes that reward that much more fulfilling. Every worthwhile goal has a cost associated with it, and if everybody could just achieve it by living their normal life, like, it wouldn't be that worthwhile.
You open up our conversation today talking about the back end of the newsletters and the podcasts because you were in Tokyo. And the next piece we're going to talk about today is the art of championship racing, the tactics champions use to win and stay out of trouble. You start this piece by saying, if you watch the 2025 World Championships in Tokyo, you probably noticed the late stages of distance races have been pure chaos. Take us through this piece, specifically as someone who was boots on the ground in Tokyo and got to experience a lot of these races.
Yeah, so Tokyo was an amazing experience. Not only did I get to watch the performances live, but I also got a chance to spend a lot of time on the warm-up track where I saw the athletes preparing for their events, coming back afterwards, having the debriefs with their coaches. I spoke with a lot of coaches who were, working with people who are ultimately world champions, people who ended up getting disqualified, all of the above. So there was a lot of drama being there on the ground myself, but even for a casual viewer, I think there were some really awesome finishes this year that really showed the value of championship racing. Most of track and field these days has turned into an optimized time trial where with wave lights and rabbits, you put a bunch of people on the track. It's a war of attrition. By two-thirds of the way through the race, there's only one person left in the slipstream of the rabbit, and then it's just them against the clock. And there's not that much drama, there's not that much intrigue. But in a championship race, when you remove those variables, I mean, man, we saw some unbelievable things that seemingly defied logic of what I thought was good race tactics, which kind of was the impetus for writing this piece. In the men's distance events alone, I think if you take the 800 all the way up to the marathon, like the cumulative time separating first from second is probably like about a second between all of those events together. I mean, the 800 was a photo finish, the 1500 was essentially a photo finish, the marathon was a photo finish, which you hardly ever see. And so it makes you look at these events and be like, wow, okay, when the finishes are that close, it makes you really scrutinize every decision that was made in the race. And you're like, what could this person have done differently? What could that person have done differently to try to win? And ultimately, I think sometimes it can lead you to some very unsatisfying conclusions because there's a million different ways a race can unfold, and specific tactics are really, really hard from a coach's perspective to address ahead of time. The best tactical decisions are always made at the point of maximal information, which is when the race is unfolding itself, and it's really hard as a coach to project how something is going to go. Sure, if Jakob Ingebrigtsen is in a race, you can bet that it's going to be pretty fast. But in the men's 1500 this year, other events, like you're just kind of guessing as to how things are going to go. So I've always found it a very intriguing challenge to try to teach athletes how to approach tactical races and how to teach them principles, not necessarily specific lessons, to help them understand how they could perform as well as possible in that environment.
I think I asked Ethan this question. I definitely asked Milt this question, or maybe the other way around. Do you think that you can learn tactics, or do you think that they're innate, or a little bit of both?
So it's a little bit of both, but I'm going to bring in a third variable here, which is another elephant in the room. I think that one thing that is underappreciated, in my opinion, is that superior fitness is always going to supersede tactics. In other words, if you're a 348 miler and you're Ethan Strand, you can do things in the last 200 to 300 meters that your competition can't do simply because you have much better fitness. And I think what we often ascribe to as tactical brilliance is really just superior fitness, giving them more wiggle room to escape from troublesome situations, and just they can run wide and get away with it. They can run in lane 2 or lane 3 and get away with it because they're actually just fitter. So first and foremost, I think you need to show up to the line in peak fitness, no matter what. Like, you need to be able to produce faster times than your competition can. I do think I think championship races I write at the end are unpredictable, but I think they're not. The tactics that are applied are not unlearnable. And I think there are a few things that on the whole, if you look at the races, you see the same recurring themes time and time again. So I would say they're definitely a teachable skill. And the more you put yourself in those situations, the more you can internalize those lessons.
Let's use some football terms. A lot of NCAA top programs, they have their weekly film sessions. Let's say you take over a running program, high school or college, and you implement kind of a same strategy. You get everyone in the same room. First meeting of the season, leading into track season or cross country season, and you want to preach on tactics. What's the first principle you're going to teach your new team that you think would have the greatest gain and effect on their ability to understand and implement better tactics into their racing?
Yeah, I think it depends. So I think there's two things you need to try to avoid in race, or two things you're going for in races. One is to try to win, and the second is to try to stay out of trouble. And I think there's different things that apply to both of those situations. The first thing I bring up in the newsletter is this principle, and if we were watching film, I would try to point this out, which is to ride the tiger by the neck, not the tail. This is something that we talked about in college when we were racing. The idea being you can't really ride a tiger effectively by grabbing its tail and trying to hang on for dear life. And that metaphor, when applied to racing, basically means you can't run from the back. You need to be in contention when the moves are made. And so everyone knows from watching tactical races that there's a lot of dilly-dallying sometimes that happens for the first 75% of it. But when moves are made, you cannot be typically in like 12th or 15th place and expect to run around the entire field and still win. And this was actually analyzed in a study that I looked at. The 1500 is a great event for analyzing tactics because there's so many different ways it can be run, and there's almost always tactical intrigue because the 5K is just a matter of like fitness, right? It's just like pure cardiovascular output. Same thing with the 10 and the marathon typically. But what this study looked at was it said, okay, when the kick started, where were the eventual medalists, both silver, or gold, silver, and bronze? And they found that in fast races, which tend to be a little bit more strung out, you had to be up front, typically in first or second, if you wanted to win. In medium races, and these were all categorized in a certain way, for professional men, they looked at all of the races from the 2000 Olympics and every World Championships from there until 2020, I believe. And they found that in a medium races, so these were probably like 337 or 335 races for men, you had to be typically within third or fifth place if you wanted to win. And then in slow races, where everyone's bunched up, it didn't actually matter as much. So the point is, like, regardless of the race type, the principle is pretty clear. When the decisive move comes, you always need to be close enough to respond, and you need to be in the driver's seat. I think one underappreciated attribute that you see in really high performers is that they put themselves in the race and they're not afraid to run it from the front. Maybe not necessarily leading, but one thing, if you ask Coach Milton, I think he said this on his interview, is what can you identify in a freshman to know they're going to be really, really good? Typically, it's when the gun goes off, do they take a back seat to the competition, or do they actually like stick their nose in it and run it from the front, even if it's like, even if they like risk blowing up a little bit and they're running over their ability level? That's typically a differentiating factor between understanding who's going to be good and great. Being tentative in races is not, you can't be tentative and win races. Like, I write here, like, nothing about winning a race is passive. As simple as it may seem, you can't beat someone without passing them, and you can't win a race without taking the lead. Simple, but obviously very profound and applicable statement.
Let's talk to more cross country. Let's talk to the second through seventh man on most teams, because a lot of our discussion is geared towards people trying to win races. Vast majority of people listening aren't yet in that position, probably dream of being in that position one day, but let's meet them where they're at. What are ways that people can, win their race within a race, and what are the tactics that you feel like most people can use to ultimately, races, maybe their first place is placing 30th at a meet. And I think something to bring up here too, if it fits, is the piece on drafting. I thought was personally fascinating.
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of different thoughts, some of which I didn't actually specifically write about in the newsletter. But you're right. The majority of the audience we're talking to is not necessarily going to be able to win their next race. And so ultimately this becomes a question of, can you win the race within the race, so to speak? Whoever your competition is, whatever your reference point is, can you outperform your ranking? Can you beat the people that you're supposed to be around? And so one thing that I think applies across the board, and this is independent of where you finish in the pack, is so many people start races at like peak emotional energy, and then it fades and tapers the entire time. So they can't pull anything from the well at the end, because they just, all of their the pent up energy got released within the first 400 meters, and they have nothing to draw from after that. The way I like to think about it is like, you really need to dig in and buckle in when this race gets to the halfway point, and you need to internalize, can I be a runner who's going to be a second half performer? So many times what you'll see in cross country is people go out way over their heads. And if you were to analyze like the pacing strategies of the majority of the middle of the pack, where it's really, really crowded real estate, most of those people are going to be fading. And you can actually make up a significant amount of ground just by maintaining pace or slightly accelerating in the middle to the end. And I'm not talking about the final 200 meters where everyone's kicking. I'm talking about, can you actually dig in and be strong through the middle of that race? So in college, when we ran cross country, it was always we really try to internalize, can we be a second half team? When you hit 4K of an 8K or when you hit 5K of a 10K, can you actually be coming on? Can you be bringing emotional energy at that point where everyone else is starting to fade and feel sorry for themselves? Two other things. Oh, go ahead.
No, keep going.
Okay. The other two other things. When you make a move, you have to commit to it. This applies to everybody. It especially applies to people who are trying to win races, but it applies to anyone in a pack. In a race, it's not about throwing like 100 little jabs and surges. You have to find a moment in time for the knockout punch. So this is true on track racing especially. In fact, it's probably more applicable in track racing now that I say it. I always think like in an 800 meter race or a 1500 meter race, you have one move, decide when you're going to make it and be decisive. Be all in on that move and make that decision at the point when you're going to get maximal return from making that move, wherever that point may be. There are points and times where like if you're trying to beat a pack of people in a longer race and you're one of the stronger athletes, you can throw in some probing surges to just like, you'll see this in marathons oftentimes. People will surge ahead of the pack and see if they snap. I like to think about in a race, I can almost envision like there being an elastic band between the leader and like the pack and the followers. And a lot of times that elastic band will stretch, and then there's almost a definitive moment where that elastic band breaks and like you completely lose traction. And so sometimes when you're racing other people around you, try to stretch the band and force people to make uncomfortable decisions and see if they snap. Because if they do, they're not coming back. Like once they're done, they're done. The last thing, which you already mentioned too, is the energetic cost of drafting. So on a calm day with a little bit or no wind, overcoming air resistance, running yourself, typically takes about 2 to 4% of your energy output. And if you run behind people, and this is especially true on windy days, you're actually eliminating most of that energetic cost. And so there's also the psychological component as well, which is when you're in the lead, you constantly need to be vigilant of what's going on. You're the one setting the pace, you're bracing for attacks, and you're carrying the stress of having the target on your back. So being able to save the metabolic cost of being behind people from a drafting perspective, and B, get the psychological advantage of being the one who's hunting, not the one who's being hunted, is a tremendous advantage.
When I butted in accidentally, but maybe also intentionally, because I thought you were wrapping up your answer there. This story that I've definitely shared, I got injured my junior year of high school and made it back just in time for postseason. And every week, it's like, can you make top 12? Do you advance? Do you advance? Do you advance? And admittingly enough, I had this funny thought in the back of my head every week, which was, I knew because I had the injury, I felt like it was like my time off. I didn't feel like I needed, time off to go into indoor track. And so if I was going to continue my season, my long run would have been a little shorter than it would have been if it was indoor track, because it would have been, straight into a higher mileage phase. And so kids would go out so fast as you're describing. And I was always the type of runner who would come from behind. I just never went out as fast. I feel like I generally had pretty good strategy. Inevitably, a mile in, it was like always like top 12, top 8. I'd be like 30th in the pack. And I'd just be like, looks like 13 miles tomorrow. And then slowly but surely, like every 400 meters, going to mile 2, I'd cut a few places. And then I eventually, made it to states. But there was always that funny thought in hindsight. I was like, why was I thinking about tomorrow's long run within the race? Don't recommend doing, but that example exemplifies even my racing style, which I do think was a smart one, which was just like people go out so fast in cross country races to then just die. And if you can kind of control that adrenaline and that emotion and channel it, I would say between like 2 and 4K, if it's a 5K race, is so important. And I think you can do the majority of the race within that. And then even your point about, making a decisive move. Obviously you see it at the front of races, people who are winning races, but I never won a race in high school, and it felt like, also a funny story about that. Give me a second, finish this point, and then I have a funny thing to tell you. I always felt like, you're in a pack of 5 guys and you're fighting to beat them out for the team score. It's like, it's almost more important there. That was always a principle I really tried to take into high school. Completely off subject. I was at Hoka Manhattan 2 weeks ago, and we're at the finish line. Everyone, the photographers, videographers, fighting for space, and this old guy who's shot this meet for years and years goes to me. He goes, do you know who has the course record here? I don't know if he has this right. I was like, I don't. He's like, ran for Stanford. I'm like, really? I threw out a few names. He was like, nope. He was like, what? He was like, I'll tell you the state. I was like, okay. And he was like, Connecticut. I was like, oh, really? I was like, Alex Osberg? He was like, yep. He had no clue we were related at all. He had no clue. I was like, that's cool. So, anyways,
I ran
so
that my
off
senior
topic,
year in
but I
cross
thought
country.
that was hilarious. I forgot to tell you that.
No,
He was all
I'm
proud that he
surprised.
knew it. He was all proud that he knew it. He was like, I was here.
That's good. Yeah, it was would have been 2014. So I'm actually kind of surprised that record has stood for that long. I believe it was Edward Cheserick who had it beforehand. And it was, I think I read 11:57 on the 4K course. So yeah, tough course too. It's like flat for 400 meters and then climbs for most of it. So yeah, no, that is true. That was one of my better races in high school cross country. So yeah, I mean, just to reiterate one more point that you said, because I think this is a really good action item for people who are going into championship season in cross country. It's so important to have the discipline with your pacing strategy in the first 400 to 800 meters. Don't burn too many. Like, you need to burn a match. You have like a few matches to burn in a race. You need to burn a match to get into position to see the people that you want to beat. If they're out of eye shot, like if you can't even see them, usually it's going to be hard to stay motivated enough to beat them. But if you can burn a match to get into position, then try to turn the brain off, coast for a little bit, and then really try to dig in and engage when that second half of the race comes along, that's really important. And shadow the people that you want to beat, right? Like, it's always nice to be like, if you're in a pack of 8, be like 6th or 7th. So you have good visibility of everyone. A trick that I always used to use is like listen to people's breathing. That's usually a good tell to see how much they're hurting. If someone's just like sucking wind and like sounds asthmatic, which you'll hear, they are probably cooked. And so like that means they're like susceptible and they're vulnerable. So like those are people that you should be able to get rid of pretty easily. But just so many people can't contain the anxiety in the first 400, 800 meters. And like they basically take themselves out of the race because they burn too many matches early on and they have nothing to give at the end.
Yeah, final point, because I know we're dragging long on this edition, but hopefully all good, valuable stuff for you all listening. I almost think in high school I would always hear kids say, oh, I'm just going to try to stick with so-and-so from this team the whole time. And it's like, why are you basing your racing plan on someone else who you have no clue their racing plan? And I think a lot of people can make these assumptions that like they need to see X, Y, and Z person the whole time within the race to like actually work hard or perform. And it's like, that's a training issue if that's the case. And you probably need to do some reps without a watch or a workout without a watch to really get in tune with your system to know that you can execute a 5K, just as well with people as you do without people. Obviously a race is going to motivate you, but something I took a lot of confidence in was I trained a lot by myself in high school. And so I felt like when I got within the race, yes, I keyed off of other people, but I never let other people's race strategy affect my own, because I was just not the type who could go out in a 5K at like almost my 2-mile pace, which a lot of kids do, and then they burn out.
Yeah.
So I was like, my competition I know might be 15, probably not 15, maybe 10 seconds faster at the mile mark than I'm going to be. As long as I, see him around the 2-mile mark or with 800 to go, I'm in good territory. So almost like know yourself and your strengths. So then you don't start tweaking, as the kids would say, 400 meters into a race when they're 50 meters ahead. Don't feel like, as you said, you need to burn the matches to catch up to them. Don't use someone else's racing playbook as your own.
100%. There's pretenders and there's contenders, and everybody's mixed in for the first half of the race. The actual contenders start to rise to the top once you get to the second half, and the pretenders are going to blow up. You're always going to see that at every level of racing. There's always going to be some people way over their head early on, and you need to have the wherewithal and the emotional maturity to be able to weather that storm.
Or you could throw out the last 18 minutes and race like Steve Prefontaine and go balls to the wall from the beginning and see how long you can last.
I say at the end, the other decision is, are you going to go gun to tape? And that's like, I wouldn't always recommend it, but in the right scenario, run your own race and force people to beat you. If you go in and you're the definitive favorite, hey, if you take it out hard and you only have to sprint against one person to win rather than the entire field, that's a consideration. So obviously you need to run these calculations, these cost-benefit analyses, and these risk-reward ratio benefits or calculations, with your coach. But That is also another
Die with
option.
valor. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you can't race well if you're not properly fueled. Next edition, Fuel for the Work Required, the simple carb playbook top runners actually use. Why are world-class athletes subtly eating more carbs than ever? I've done a bunch of conversations with sports dietitians before. I hope many people listening today have heard them, and so I think a lot of people do understand that, you know, carbs are necessary and needed. But something that always surprises me, Alex, is people don't realize, including myself, just how many carbs they need and how carbs are truly the secret sauce to greatness as a runner. Can you elaborate on some of these subjects and why you wrote this piece?
Yeah, we're starting to see these trends emerge in the endurance world right now. I always say that cycling tends to be like 10 years ahead of running. And cycling is in the midst of a high carb fueling revolution right now, where they're just like sucking down tons of gels and having these massive meals in between. Like there's been some great articles, and I link to them if you read the newsletter. We're starting to see it permeate into running a little bit. There's an ultra runner, David Roach, who won the Leadville 100, who has been fueling with 150 grams of carbohydrates per hour. I know that's hard to contextualize or wrap your head around. It's a lot. Just take my word for it. And then there was an article or a profile that came out on Hobbs Kessler, which showed that he was drinking Country Time lemonade and eating Rice Krispies like within 15 minutes of his workout because of how important his sports physiologist told him.
He said it on the podcast before.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Just because of how important he had conversations with his his sports scientist who works with him, and he's like, yeah, it's that important. You're doing 2 sessions a day. You gotta replenish your carbohydrate stores, so get it in as fast as possible. And it doesn't even need to be a high quality source. High quality, I say that with parentheses. Like it can be processed food, like if that's what it takes, because you need to get it in. So anyway, I've been following that pretty closely. It's been very interesting. And I think what a lot of people miss is like, why is it important? And so fundamentally, running is about converting chemical energy into mechanical energy or movement. And that energy is derived from 2 primary sources, fat and carbohydrate. At very low intensities, you burn fat. So like if you're walking or jogging, you burn fat. And we have tons of fat on board. In fact, you have enough fat in your body, even really, really lean people, to probably sustain you for multiple marathons back to back. The problem is it burns slowly, and you can't really burn that as a fuel source when you're running fast. If you're actually running a pretty hard pace, certainly not if you're above threshold. That's when you actually start dipping into your carbohydrate stores. For those people who study biology into the field, you're actually relying on your glycolytic system. So you're using glycolysis to break down glucose and turn it into ATP. And that carbohydrate is stored in the liver and the muscle, and there's a fixed amount in the body. You can carbo load and maybe boost it up a little bit, but it's way less than fat. And you usually can blow through it within about 90 minutes of hard running. So that's why it's always a consideration in the marathon, because you're going to bonk once you've gone through your carbohydrate stores. So you have to have this high octane fuel. You have it both internally, and then you also can get exogenous carbohydrate, which is basically meaning, can you take it in from another source? So a lot of people are going to be fueling now during workouts, during marathons with carbohydrate, because they recognize the importance of this fuel source in terms of sustaining high output in terms of exercise. There's so many different ways we can go with the fueling conversation. I grounded this newsletter specifically in a framework called Fuel for the Work Required, which thinks about what are your carbohydrate needs on a day-to-day basis. In future newsletters, I'm definitely going to talk about marathon fueling. I'm going to talk about it within running, like fueling within training sessions, etc. But the idea is, what you have to understand is that different training intensities draw from different fuel tanks. And because of that, that's why you need to change your nutrition and turn those dials or pull those levers differently on certain days of training. So just like no 2 consecutive days of training are the same, no one out there pursuing big goals in the sport is going to do a 30-minute run every day of the week, right? They're going to do typically 2 workouts. They're going to do a long run. They're going to do some easy runs. They're going to do some strength training. The menu, if you will, of training differs day to day. And the menu of the food you need to be consuming should differ day to day to match the energy that you're burning. In other words, you need to return what you burn. So that's kind of the premise of the piece.
So many different directions we could go. I guess just a general conversation to not spoil the contents of the newsletter Yeah, if you thought we were giving you full free content today, you were wrong. You have to do the work. You have to go open your phone and do the super hardest thing. Click on the link below. It's so hard. I feel so sorry for you. Why do you? We texted about this, but why this piece blew up? And anytime we write even remotely about nutrition, it blows up. And anytime I have any sort of registered dietitian on, kind of blows up. Why do you think people are so fascinated by nutrition and yet still generally get it wrong and don't actually put the pieces into action? For instance, I guarantee you most people listening today have heard carbs are important, but yet they'll walk out of this and not actually make changes next time they go to the grocery store.
Yeah, so nutrition is an interesting subject because it's one of these places in life where you can substitute experience and assume that that's expertise. Like no one in their right mind would go up to a heart surgeon or a neurosurgeon and say, I can do your job. Like, just give me like a little bit of training, right? Like they're like, no, this is like a 10-year commitment. Same thing with a pilot, right? But with nutrition, we all eat 3 meals a day and we all follow influencers these days. And therefore, I think everyone assumes like they're their own expert. But the key difference is that it's a strategy that is simple, but not easy. And that's true of almost anything in life. Like the highest yield actions that you can take are usually not that complicated. But really the thing that separates the people who are really good from the average people is, can you commit to the boring details day in and day out? So I think it's a strategy that feels accessible. And I think people are like, oh, this is like something that I can apply to my own training. But this is one of those like places where the knowledge implementation gap is as true as ever, right? Like just because you know something doesn't mean you're going to do it. And can you faithfully execute on those small details is really what it comes down to. And I think a lot of people just don't. I think it takes planning. It takes being deliberate and intentional. And it takes repeating oftentimes boring details for days and days on end for there to be any noticeable impact.
Based off of the things you write in this piece, if you want to reference them in relation to your response here, go for it. What's the number one thing that people should be implementing into their diet, into their nutrition, that if you had to guess, they probably aren't?
Yeah, really, it's about, again, this concept of fuel for the work required and returning what you burn. And so what you need to understand is that on days when you're exercising really hard, you're not only burning more calories total, but you're selectively drawing from your carbohydrate fuel tank. And so that means that any day that you're running hard, so that would be there'll be a long run greater than 60 minutes with any bit of intensity in it. That would be threshold, that would be hills, that would be anything challenging. You're depleting your carbohydrate stores. So you have to flex up your carbohydrate needs on those days. And any other day, it's like not necessarily as important. But the reason that's so crucial is that if you're training hard, especially if you're training hard every day of the week or training hard multiple times a week, sometimes even multiple times within a day, if you don't replenish your carbohydrate afterwards, or if you go into it depleted or you don't fuel during, typically the level of stored carbohydrate or glycogen in your body is going to drop off precipitously, and it's going to impair your performance for the next time around. It also impacts things like immunity, recovery, bone health. I mean, the list is getting longer and longer. So if you're energy deficient or you're carbohydrate deficient, it's going to hurt you either in terms of recovery or performance. And I wouldn't want that for anybody in the audience here. So that's probably the most important thing. On days when you train hard, make sure your carbohydrate intake, reflects that.
Can you take me through balance optimization with enjoyment? I think that's a pretty important piece that gets overlooked a lot of times by type A runners. Yeah.
So I hope this doesn't sound too contradictory, but I think it is worth introducing some nuance here. When you think about nutrition, I think there's an optimal level of commitment to a strategy. I think if it becomes an all-consuming thing where you track every single calorie or you track every single macronutrient intake down to the gram, it becomes a very dangerous game with a slippery slope. The base rates or the prevalence of disordered eating, body dysmorphia, eating disorders in running, unfortunately, is very high. And we know a lot of people already suffer from relative energy deficiency in this sport. And so everything that I'm saying here is important, but I don't want the wrong message to land with the audience, which is, you have, like, if you're going to miss miss on the high side, because you have to understand that the risk of being overfueled is much smaller compared to the risk of being underfueled. So I always think you need to say, okay, I can extract the general principle here, which is that I need to eat more on hard days. I need to choose the right sources of those extra calories, which is carbs before, during, and after those key sessions. But I also need to recognize here that, like, I don't need to optimize this thing down to like planning out every single meal. Like, I think extracting the general principle is probably good enough. And a really good way to do that is just to follow your hunger cues. If you're an athlete who's growing and developing, or you're a master's athlete, like, you should eat when you're hungry. I'm not saying you should overindulge like every time, but you should eat when you're hungry, and you shouldn't be depriving yourself of calories or like depriving yourself of a meal that's enjoyable just because you have to try to hit a certain target. I think there has to be a bit more wiggle room than that. And again, this is an area where it's more important to be generally correct than precisely wrong.
Any final notes before we move on to the final edition, talking about mediocrity?
No, let's go on to the last one.
Okay. Final thing we're going to cover today. Resist the pull of mediocrity, what it means to be above average, not average, exactly the opposite of that in today's world. I was saving something I wanted to share with you when you were talking about Jerry and that quote, "It takes what it takes," because I thought it would be better properly directed in relation to this article. I've shared this on a podcast I did with Mitch Ammons. I recorded it in BPN's podcast studio in Austin, Texas. And I think I got this from Chris Williamson, although I listen to so many podcasts, I forget to attribute who to what. I'm sure you're in a similar boat sometimes. But he was basically saying everyone in life wants to be exceptional, but they don't realize that that very word, the first part of it, is exception. And so to be exceptional, you have to be an exception. And yet everyone wants to be like everyone else, but to do that would to just be normal, which is to not be exceptional. And that's one of my favorite concepts I've come across this year, is literally just breaking down the word exceptional. And I think it puts a lot of words and a lot of support to people and can comfort a lot of people when they feel like they're outcasts and an exception from everyone else, and to reframe being an exception and being different as actually that being a necessity to ultimately be exceptional.
I what a great intro, because I totally agree with that. And you know, you brought Coach Milt on a podcast in August this year, and he said that he has to get 18 to 22-year-olds excited about not living the life of a typical college student. And that is hard to do, right? Like, in college, you cannot afford to live a normal college life if you want to be a great athlete. And so excellence in those contexts, not only in a team, but also as an individual, it requires you to create a counterculture. It requires you to create a narrative around the excitement of being different. And it really is just going with the flow and passively following like the inertia of daily life is not going to get you extraordinary results. Extraordinary results happen to the people who resist conformity. They're the ones who resist like the priorities that the universe wants to set for them. They have to be the author of their own story. They're high agency people who, like, life doesn't happen to them, they happen to life. And that's really a crucial difference. There's two ideas here to just bounce, just to kind of conclude the thought that you started. C.S. Lewis says, when the whole world is running towards a cliff, he who is running in the opposite direction appears to have lost his mind. And the other one is from Nietzsche. I'm saying this from memory, so it may not be totally correct. It's something like, those who dance are considered mad by those who cannot hear the music. And sometimes if you want to be exceptional, like, you need to get to a point where the daily actions of what the average is don't really make sense anymore. They need to be like repulsive to you. The average person in the United States doesn't really live a life that I am that jealous of. And I'm not trying to say that from a place of moral superiority. I just have no desire to be average in that way. Because
Can I hop in here?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
To piggy off of that, you write some amazing statistics. You say the average person walks fewer than 5,000 steps per day, spends 7 hours per day staring at a screen. For Gen Z, it's 9 hours. Spends more time alone now than at any point since 1965. And lastly, more than 50% of Americans don't have enough saved to cover a $1,000 emergency. So when you say you don't want the average life and you put those stats to it, it's like, oh, you're not that crazy for not wanting that.
Exactly. I say that, once you realize how low the bar has fallen, you stop mistaking normal for acceptable. and you realize that average is not something to strive for. And just to put in a little plug to the audience here, and everyone should commend themselves, maybe even some people are running while listening to this, distance running is a forcing function, right? You have to be above average, in my opinion, on multiple fronts if you want to pursue this hobby that we all do, which is extremely difficult. You can't train seriously without becoming more disciplined, without becoming more resilient and more deliberate with your daily approach to life. And runners, I think, have to adopt this identity that they're not like everyone else. And the activity that we choose to pursue constantly and continually reaffirms the value of being different. And to bring in one of my favorite ideas in behavior change and identity, James Clear says that every action you take is a vote for the type of person that you want to become. Everyone who wakes up early or laces up their shoes at some point in the day is casting that vote and creating a different version of themselves. And I love that.
Ooh, many sections I want to dive into, not time for all of them. I guess, can you walk us into the crab mentality?
Yeah. So there's this idea, it's called the crab mentality, which I guess I should probably give the example first to make sense of what that means. If you put a crab in a bucket, I've actually never seen this, so maybe I shouldn't take this at face value, but I think it's true. If you put a crab into a bucket, it will crawl out on its own. But if you put multiple crabs in a bucket, they will pull each other down every time one tries to escape. And also, if a crab tries to escape multiple times, sometimes the other crabs will apparently break their legs because they don't want one person to get out. Like, they all want to basically just like commiserate and suffer together. And extreme example, I know, but I think this actually does pop up in daily life. There's typically, for those people who are on a journey of self-improvement or self-development, there's going to become a point where your own growth exposes the stagnation or kind of like the stationarity. Is that a word? I think so. Of like your friend group. Yeah. And the natural reaction isn't always positive. Like, I think that when you're on the rise, everyone can cheer for you only up until the point of like proficiency that they are. But when you start to get better than them, and you're achieving your goals, which is greater than your friend group, I don't think they're going to cheer for you anymore because you're going to remind them of the dreams that they didn't achieve anymore. And so that the tone starts to change. You remind them of what they gave up on. So there's this lonely chapter typically where like you're trying to be better. You've kind of outgrown your old group and you haven't yet found a new one that understands you and is willing to match your level of ambition. So I would just say, like, be mindful of that and know that there's always going to be a gravitational pull towards conformity and towards mediocrity. And it's a continual act of resistance to be above that.
I've got a banger quote for you off of that. People root for you on your way up because you remind them of their dreams, and they try to tear you down once you're there because you remind them that they gave up on them. Everyone wants you to do well, just not better than them. And it's funny because in my personal experience, I don't think I've ever received hate from a successful entrepreneur who didn't go to college, but I've received so much hate from people who did go to college. And it's glaringly obvious why. Like, people don't want people who are taking unorthodox paths or different paths than they themselves took doing better than them. And I like to be optimistic and think of the world as bubbly and rainbows. And I think a lot of times it can be, but I also think people are very selfish and people a lot of times don't want to see others succeed or be better than them. And even being in my heart, like, I a lot of times have to keep that part of my heart in check of like, oh, this person's doing good, or this, everyone can eat at the table was a phrase someone once said to me that I really, really like. Because it is in our biology to not want to see other people do better than us because we come from tribes and there were scarcity mindsets. And so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have those thoughts, but it's just, let your kindness and your overarching, supportive mindset take over those unkind thoughts and be supportive. And I think, not to branch too far out here, but this conversation happens a lot in toxic teams. It's like, you should want to see your teammates do better than you, even though it's not a normal desire. And can you break down your walls of pride and selfishness and realize that, hey, you might train just as hard as your teammate and they might do better than you, and are you going to decide to be the bigger man and celebrate them in their success rather than wallow in your self-pity that you didn't beat them? I think I see so many toxic cultures fall into that where everyone's beating up on each other because they're all selfish and don't want to see other people do well, and it's like, well, this is the exact opposite of what a team should be.
Excellent point. That's actually a newsletter that I have in the works, and so I may quote you on that. Uh, just to wrap up and bring this into kind of two specific behaviors that I see oftentimes. Winners and losers have the same goals, right? We've said this many times. It's not the goals that define you; it's the systems that you have that you approach daily life with that really separate winners and losers. And two things that I think people can take away from this conversation. One is, who's your reference group? You had Charles on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and there was this really memorable quote from him where he said something like, if you're worried about just making teams, you're not really going to be in the conversation for winning medals. And I think what that brings into focus is, what is your reference group? Are you just trying to be better than, the fourth American? Or are you trying to be better than the fourth person in the world? I think so many people are living life and trying to just survive in advance, even if it's by the smallest margin possible. Or, and this is sometimes more important because I think we all do this, they console themselves after a bad result by comparing down to those who did worse. And it's just like, no, like, hold yourself to a really high standard and play the game at a high level and be willing to have that hard conversation with yourself to be like, I wasn't good enough today. And I actually do believe in myself to not feel self-pity. But I'm going to compare up, not compare down. I think that's really important. And the last thing I'll say is, what personal excellence means to you. I think a lot of times we want to be perceived as great by others, but what it really comes down to is, what is your own personal standard of excellence? Because that's the thing that's going to come with you every day, in every interaction, in every behavior. And Kobe said this better than anyone else. There's an interview which we can link to, or if you read the newsletter, I have the hyperlink there. He did it with Ahmad Rashad, and he was asked whether during a particularly difficult season, the expectations of fans added pressure to him. And he scoffed. He laughed basically at the interviewer, and he was like, no, dude. He's like, their expectations will never be higher than my own. Never, 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 never. And I mean, if other people's expectations are higher than your own in a certain thing that you're doing in life, you're probably in the wrong job, is my opinion, or you're doing the wrong thing.
To your first point, I have found myself being like everyone else and saying the refrain of, you did the best you could and that's enough. But I think recently I hate that phrase. Sometimes we hate to say it, but sometimes, you did the best you could isn't enough. And that's a harsh reality. That's a very harsh reality. And I think, Alex, one of the best skills that the best people in the world have is this, again, everything in moderation, everything in balance, but is this self-awareness, this ability to self-evaluate and say, I could have been better in X, Y, and Z area. And when you mess up, to genuinely own it. There's nothing worse than in relationship. I'm not just talking about romantic, but, friendship, family, teammate, where someone's in the wrong and their pride will not allow them to own up to it and say, hey, I could have been better. Hey, I'm sorry I didn't reply to this email. It's not like me. It won't happen again. Rather than coming up with a whole laundry list of excuses, or, hey, I chickened out on the workout today. I simply just I wasn't tough. I didn't want to work hard today. But so many people are so scared of truly being their vulnerable selves and displaying themselves as weak that they put up all these defense mechanisms, which is almost more painful if you're on the other receiving end of it, because you can see through the defense mechanisms and you're just like, where's the self-honesty? Where's the self-ownership? Own up to this and I can meet you in that. I can't meet you in this reality where you're putting up all these projections that I know aren't true.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Extreme ownership and accountability, another defining trait of high performers. Let me pause 1 second. I just have to find this one line that I wrote.
Go for it.
So sorry to the editor. Okay, resuming in 3, 2, 1. One thing that I wrote about, this is just a little sneak preview to the newsletter that's already published, which we're going to recap in probably the next month, is a habit of high performers just taking personal responsibility for things, whether they're both good things or bad things. And I write, winners define themselves by what they made happen, and losers define themselves by what happened to them. Great performers will rarely point the finger of blame. They tend to look inward first, and they're not afraid to admit that to other people. So I love to echo what you just said, and I think that's so true.
Alex, we're coming up on an hour, so we'll wrap this one up. If you listen and you enjoyed, I can almost guarantee you'll also enjoy the newsletter. Again, I've left links in the show notes. It's completely free. New edition every single Thursday morning. If you don't like it, you can unsubscribe. You see the subscriber count, Alex. I see the subscriber count. I don't think it's ever gone down, so I don't really think people unsubscribe. So take a bet. Listen to me. If you're 59 minutes into the podcast, you can trust me and my opinions, and so really recommend subscribing. And if you enjoy it or enjoyed this episode, shoot me a DM or an email with any words or thoughts. We're always looking to take ownership and be better. That's our goal, Alex and my goal. And Alex, appreciate it. I will talk to you 4 more editions from now, and appreciate all of your hard work and all the effort you put into helping others be their best selves.
Thank you. This has been a fun one.